My experience with the sport of wrestling is very limited. As you could probably guess just by looking at me, not exactly the classic wrestler's build. And I've never been much into the WWE. So if you're hoping that my stories about wrestling will be drawn from the world of Hulk Hogan and John Cena, you'll be disappointed. I will share one experience I've had with wrestling as a sport. I was in high school, and even skinnier then than I am now. It was my misfortune in gym class to be chosen to wrestle against a member of the varsity team who thoroughly enjoyed humiliating me in front of my peers. There's something about being pinned to a mat against your will in front of a cackling crowd of teenagers that really stays with you. So yeah, I've never been much of a fan of that sort of wrestling, even in its most cartoonish forms. I tend to stick with more intellectual rather than physical forms of wrestling. Wrestling with a difficult text, wrestling with a philosophical problem. The wrestling that comes from two sharp minds in dialogue with one another. But I have deeply enjoyed physical wrestling in one form. Wrestling with my sons. When they were much younger and much smaller, we could sustain a wrestling match for quite a while, usually involving a lot of pillows. The game we'd typically play would be that they had to figure out a way to get both of my socks off, while I had to figure out a way to push all three of them off the bed at once. For a while, the two sides in this contest were fairly evenly matched, and I have a lot of fond memories of tossing them around. Being pinned by a pile of laughing children is a much different experience than the one I had as a teenager in the basement gym of my high school. But the thing about these playful combats with my children is that I was always in control. I always knew exactly where each child's body was in space, and I could calibrate the pressure and the energy with great care and precision, so that no one was ever truly in danger, even if they might have felt sometimes like they were. And if things ever did seem to be spiraling out of control, I could pull the dad card and just stop the fight. So in that sense, the wrestling that I enjoyed with my boys was closer to a dance than to an actual wrestling match. Highly choreographed, and not nearly as risky as it might have felt to them, or looked to my wife. And this brings me to the real point of this sermon. Sometimes we must be prepared to truly wrestle, to risk humiliation, to put ourselves out into the world without the protection of a watchful parent. When Marcus Aurelius claims that the art of life is more like the wrestler's art than the dancer's, this is what he is hinting at. There are moments in your life where you have to be on the defensive, treating life like an enemy to be overthrown, not like a partner peacefully offering a dance in which the steps are traditional and the moves are predictable and comforting. Life throws challenges in you. And some of those challenges take the form of a wrestler who will not let you pass and will not have mercy if you do not throw him before he throws you. Which brings us to the wrestling match between Antaeus and Hercules, the contest at the root of this sermon. Antaeus was the son of Poseidon and Gaia, and this divine mixture of water and earth made him immensely powerful, so long as he remained connected to the ground. Gaia, Mother Earth, was the ultimate source of his power, even though he was also the child of the god of the sea. It is striking to me that Antaeus never traveled, did not seek adventure in unfamiliar places, as a seafarer would. No, he remained in his hometown, pleased with the local fame he was able to secure by defeating passing travelers in the sport he had become an expert in, wrestling. When Hercules came by on the way to fulfilling some larger, greater quest, he defeated Antaeus in a battle that was over so quickly that Ovid in the Metamorphoses barely uses a single stanza to describe it. Hercules was the first to figure out that Antaeus' great strength would disappear as soon as he was disconnected from the earth. For both wrestlers, the stakes could not be higher. It was a contest of life and death. And yet it merits barely a mention in the epics that tell of Hercules' exploits. There are very few surviving ancient sources for this moment in mythology, this small aside in the larger story of Hercules. And yet it resonates deeply with us in modern times. I think because we so often feel uprooted, thrown by forces larger than ourselves, unable to keep our footing, to remain connected to what gives us strength and meaning. This is Ray Bradbury's take on the story. We must stay grounded, or we will lose our sense of self, our sense of what is real and true. In Ray Bradbury's version, Antaeus plays the role of a tragic hero who is undone when he forgets his roots. This seems to be the lesson that is most readily taken. Stay true to yourself, on your guard against false heroes, distracting entertainments, and unrealistic promises. But what if we look at things more from the point of view of Hercules? Here is a man on a mission, someone with a clear and, let's assume, for the sake of argument, a righteous quest. In his way stands an apparently immovable obstacle, someone with no interest in dialogue, someone who must be overcome if progress is to be made. In our current political moment, some might argue that there are some opponents that we must learn to uproot. We must be unafraid to utterly and completely defeat them. There comes a time when one's opponents can no longer be welcomed into productive dialogue, but must be defeated by any means necessary. This is not a dance, but a matter of life and death. We must be, like Hercules, unafraid of direct confrontation with fearsome opponents. What would have become of countless struggles for justice and freedom if individuals confronted by the challenge of Antaeus had cowered, had veered off the path, rather than risking all for victory? It can be difficult to tell which role we're playing in some contests. Are we the Antaeus of stubborn habit, unwilling to yield to new ways of thinking? There's also a danger in becoming the Hercules of heedless questing, unwilling to concede how our dreams of a new and better future might be leaving a path of destruction in our wake. Not wanting to be either, I have often stepped aside from momentous conflicts in favor of the safer and more comfortable role of sideline observer. I have sought to choreograph dances in my reluctance to engage in real wrestling matches. When I'm feeling self-congratulatory, I might say that this is because of my love of all humanity, my desire to see the good in everyone. I prize open dialogue and freedom of speech. And above all, I teach my students and my children to try their best to listen to every side of every argument. I still feel that that's a good thing. However, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, I must admit that having tasted humiliating defeat at the hands of a merciless and more skilled opponent. I'm often more driven by the desire to protect my own pride than by the desire to protect all human dignity. I imagine I'm not alone in this. But let's escape our self-criticisms for a moment by imagining what Antaeus was really like. Let's take a moment to consider him as a human being rather than a symbol. I wonder, what must have been going through the mind of Antaeus in that moment when his feet left the ground? Was he unaware until that instant of his fatal weakness? Imagine the shock at discovering that everything he had assumed about his place in the world was wrong. Feeling his strength depart from him, knowing that he, for the first time, would taste defeat. He must have felt the panic of a skydiver whose parachute won't open. What had been his greatest pride and pleasure had driven him to his demise. I think that we might discover in our own hearts our own private Antaeus, grounding us not in powerful core values, but in self-destructive habits, for fear of what might lie outside those familiar boundaries. Are we doomed to continue in those habits until some passing Hercules destroys us? But there's another possibility. What if Antaeus had known about his flaw all along? What if in the midst of all the glory that came with being the invincible wrestler of his hometown, he also knew that he was not, in fact, invincible at all? His fame was undeserved. He was a charlatan. There may have been, in that case, just a touch of relief at having finally met an opponent who understood him completely. He may have actually been yearning for some Hercules to come and topple him from his false pedestal. I imagine there are times in our lives where we have been, like Antaeus, even in the midst of a string of victories, secretly yearning for some Hercules to come and invite us into a new space of transformation. Who among us has the strength to be somebody else's Hercules, to grapple with and ultimately uproot this other person's darkest habits and illusions? This is the sort of wrestling that I think we might call true love. It is very rare and very precious. I imagine this sort of Hercules as having the force of a rushing stream. But there are also times in our lives when we are called upon to be Antaeus, grounded in our core values so as not to be undone by the latest distracting fad, rooted deeply to the earth and immobile in our principled resolve. Perhaps all of life can be viewed as a perpetual wrestling match between these two great forces of tradition and change, of habit and transformation. Neither side of this great contest has an absolute claim on virtue. So if this tension is eternal, and if I don't even like wrestling all that much, what are you supposed to take away from this sermon? In Plato, Socrates is compared to Antaeus because he will not let people pass without an argument. Ultimately, what is emphasized in his exchange with Theodorus is the need to not be childish. And I think this means a couple of things. First, it means that you should not shy away from the fight. Win or lose, throw or be thrown, you must, at some point, allow yourself to become unsafe, to grapple with ideas, people, and places that may throw you, that may in fact cost you everything. Whether you apply this to politics or to your personal life, to defending your community's traditions or transforming your own state of mind, you must first engage in the fight and not avoid it. And secondly, once you engage in this sort of wrestling, whether wrestling with ideas or wrestling with your demons, there is no escaping it. It is your life's work. I cannot know what each of you is wrestling with. I cannot know whether you see your role as that of Antaeus or that of Hercules, that of the rock of tradition rooted in the earth, or that of the rushing river of transformation, upending everything in a sweeping tide of change. But my wish for you is this: whether you're wrestling with addiction, wrestling with a loved one, wrestling with political opponents, or wrestling with yourself, know that you are engaged in a struggle of great consequence. Your words matter. Your actions matter. This is not a pillow fight. This is not the WWE. Your life is at stake. Fight on.